In the summer of 1973, Neil Young joined his CSNY bandmates in Hawaii, partly for a vacation, partly to get Stephen Stills off of coke, and to get the band back together and touring again. In Maui, they worked on songs such as Young's Human Highway, which they also chose as a potential title track for a possible new album. Things took a turn though when a visitor turned up, their roadie, Bruce Berry. Berry had been a roadie with CSNY, Manassas, and with the Byrds for their 1973 reunion. He turned up in Maui with a special delivery for the band of a certain white powder that was very popular amongst musicians in the early 70s, and this was basically part of his job description as a roadie at this point. But as one of the main points of the trip was to get away from the nose candy, Nash, Crosby and Young were furious with Berry, and he was sent back to LA, where he immediately went and bought a load more drugs from his friendly local dealer, who also threw in a bunch of the brown stuff along with the white stuff. This stuff was so incredibly potent that, according to his friend and fellow user Richard O'Connell, I used to have a high tolerance, he said, but that shit knocked me for a loop. After they enjoyed a heavy night, 3 days later, O'Connell had not heard from his friends since. It was a typically beautiful, sunny California morning when he drove around to his friend's house to see what was up. He knocked on the door of Berry's Santa Monica apartment, but no one answered. Finding the door unlocked, he walked in and was instantly met with the smell of death. He found Berry's lifeless body in the bedroom. The bags of dope were still lying around in the bathroom. Fellow roadie and friend of Berry's, Guillermo Giachetti, said that he never knew that Berry was doing heroin as well as coke. After the death of Danny Whitten in the November of 1972, those in Neil Young's CSNY circle who were using the drug had kept it a very close secret. Those people included David Crosby and CSNY drummer Dallas Taylor. Graham Nash said, "I never knew Cros was on it and he was my best friend." When he was asked what he thought about the death of Berry, Dallas Taylor replied, "I didn't. I just shot dope. That's all I did for 10 years. It was in this morbid atmosphere that CSNY were meant to be recording their triumphant comeback album. So with all this on his mind, on his way to the recording sessions one day, Young suddenly did an about-face. He turned round and drove over to David Briggs's house instead. There was a knock on my door and it was Neil, Briggs said. I hadn't seen him in years. He said, "I've been doing this record with CSN, but it's all wrong. I want to make a rock and roll record." Young had not worked with Briggs since after the Gold Rush in 1970. After Gold Rush, he had made Harvest with Elliot Mazer, and then made the Journey Through the Past movie, done a huge arena tour, and recorded the Time Fades Away album, put together from recordings on that tour, which was just about to be released at this time. After talking with Briggs, Young went back to Crosby, Stills and Nash and told them that he was too fatigued to start a new project. CSN, who had planned a whole year of their schedule around Young to accommodate a potential new album and tour, were outraged by Young's sudden change of heart, perhaps understandably so. But the reality was, he knew that his actual next project would be far beyond the grasp of CSNY and the Harvest producer Elliot Mazer, and even a lot of his new mainstream audience. Young knew he had to follow the Muse, even if she led him into a dark, seedy place, which indeed she did. Young was to take what was left of Crazy Horse along for the ride too. It had been Billy Talbot, the bassist in Crazy Horse, who had instigated a reunion of sorts with Young. He called Young on the phone when Young was in Hawaii with CSNY. Since after the Gold Rush, Crazy Horse had continued without Neil Young and without Danny Whitten. They'd recorded 2 albums without Whitten, Loose and At Crooked Lake, both released in 1972, but according to Billy, when we weren't playing with Neil, we were dog shit. So when Neil was back in town, they played together at a star-studded benefit concert at the Topanga Corral in August, playing a few new songs, including Walk On. Young brought in Ben Keith from the Stray Gators, who had played on Harvest with Young and on the subsequent tour, and he brought back Nils Lofgren, who played on After the Gold Rush. According to Briggs, the band checked into the sleaziest motel they could find on Sunset Boulevard, with the intention of recording the new songs at Sunset Sound, where 4 years previously they'd recorded Oh Lonesome Me and I Believe in You with Danny Whitten. But after just one day at Sunset, Briggs said that he could tell something wasn't right. Too stiff, he said. we've got to get out of this studio. Down on Santa Monica Boulevard was a rehearsal space called Studio Instrument Rentals, which was run by Bruce Berry's brother, Ken. Mind if I knock a hole in your wall? Briggs asked Ken. Briggs parked a mobile recording truck in the alley next to the building, and then they actually did bash a hole in the wall with a sledgehammer to run the cables from the rehearsal room into the truck. This way the band could play live together on the little stage in the room whilst being recorded. Neither Briggs nor Young let the musicians listen to any of the recordings back whilst they were playing. Briggs mixed the best versions there and then in the truck. It was in this environment that the new songs were recorded, but also even newer ones emerged out of the ether as they played. On the first night of the sessions, they were all sat around a table, and Young casually made the remark, "Okay, tonight's the night." This was repeated, and then it grew into a chant, which grew into an a cappella sing-along, with everyone thumping their hands on the table over and over, "Tonight's the night, tonight's the night." Young then came back the next day with this transformed into a complete song, with lyrics all about Bruce Berry, his life and his demise. And there was another vital ingredient that should not be overlooked. That was their old friend Jose Cuervo. Tequila and Hamburgers. That was the input, Young said later. As recording began, Young and the band were actually fairly straight to begin with, a little uptight, impatient over mistakes. However, as the sessions progressed, the tequila flowed, and then so did the music. Tonight's the night. Tonight's the night. Tonight's the night. They soon realised that they had to loosen up in order to make this one happen. They recorded exclusively at night, late at night. They would play pool, do coke and drink tequila until way past midnight, and then, and only then, would they start to play the songs. No one said, "Let's go play," drummer Ralph Molina said. We all just knew when it was time. Billy Talbot described the recording sessions as a drunken Irish wake. Neil Young said, "What we were doing was playing those guys on the way. We'd get really high, drink a lot of tequila, get right out on the edge. We were wide open, just wide open." He said, "I was able to step outside of myself to do this record, to become a performer of the songs rather than just the writer. Every song was performed." This recording process was way beyond what Young had attempted before. He had been aiming for spontaneity and live in the moment performances ever since Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, but this went further. With After the Gold Rush, Neil Slofgren said that the recording had been done as live as possible, but still the songs had been very well rehearsed by the time that it came to record them. This time, however, Neil said, "I've made records where you do it 3,000 times and it's perfect. I'm sick of it. I want to make a record that's totally stark naked, raw. I don't want to fix any of it." The original unedited version of the Tonight's the Night album, put together by David Briggs, contained rambling, drunken, often very funny monologues between each song. Sadly, these are now mostly unavailable, although Young has released some of the outtakes of these songs recently on his Archives Volume 2. David Briggs always maintained that his unedited version of the album was the only true version. The band treated the sessions as a live performance, albeit one without an audience, apart from Briggs. There were no windows, so it was permanently dark in the room, no matter what time it was. Despite this, they rarely took off their sunglasses, and remained sufficiently lubricated the entire time. If I wasn't a part of it, and I peeked into that room when we were playing, Ralph Molina said, I would have gone, "Whoa, what the fuck's going on here? Who are these weirdos?" Occasionally, visitors did turn up, and were gobsmacked by what they saw taking place in the dark at SIR. Photographer Joel Bernstein showed up to take pictures of each band member for their visas for a potential Japanese tour. He said, "It was like doing a documentary on nocturnal animals pulled out from under a rock. They look like little rodents when you shine a light in their eyes." Legendary film director and comedian Mel Brooks also stopped by. He was a friend of Art Linson's, who was Briggs's partner in his Spin Dizzy record label. Brooks observed the musicians sat around, basically getting completely shit-faced all night. Then, at around midnight, they suddenly got up and started recording music. He said, "You mean first they do that and then they do this?" Neil Slofgren needed a little bit more time to adjust to this way of working, perhaps more than the others. "As we learnt the songs, we'd be recording them," he said. I'd be thinking, okay, another 5 run-throughs and then I'll have my part down. But then Neil would say, okay, next song. It freaked us all out. Young was reacting to the way that records were being made in the 1970s. Technology, too much control, not enough creativity in the recording process. It wasn't about music, it wasn't about performing, he said. He also added the cleanest, dinkiest, pissantiest sounding records that could possibly be made. I hated that shit. From this era onward, Young had now started recording everything, more or less. Every run through, every gig, every jam session. I wouldn't play if the tape wasn't running, he said. Make it so there's no difference between playing and recording. Then you forget that you're recording. I just tricked myself into not having to worry about whether we were recording or not. On August the 26th, Young and the band recorded 5 performances that ended up being on the finished record. Tonight's the Night, Tired Eyes, Mellow My Mind, Speaking Out, and World on a String. Joni Mitchell stopped by as well, and they jammed and recorded a wonderfully ramshackle version of Mitchell's Raised on Robbery. Mitchell cringed when she heard back the recording, and it didn't see the light of day until the Archives Volume 2 was released by Young in 2020, as Mitchell had asked Young not to release it for many years. It's really good though. They also recorded slightly older songs like Wondering, Everybody's Alone and One More Sign. The sessions went on until September, when they recorded Roll Another Number, Albuquerque, New Mama and Tonight's the Night Part 2. The first attempt at assembling all the songs into an album followed soon after, and the intention was to keep all the drunken dialogue in between the songs. This version only had 9 songs on it, but it had the mumbling and talking between the group and me, Young said later. It was like you didn't know if these guys were still going to be alive in the morning, the way they were talking. More like awake than anything else. David Briggs held on to this original version for years on cassette. I want to tell you, it's a handful, Briggs said. It's unrelenting. There is no relief in it at all. It does not release you for 1 second. It's like some guy having you by the throat from the first note all the way to the end. As this version was nearing completion, Young decided to take the show on the road, and the band played 8 shows at the new Sunset Strip nightclub, the Roxy. In fact, these shows were the first ever shows at the club. The club was a joint venture between David Geffen, Young's manager Elliot Roberts, Lou Adler and Elmer Valentine. On the opening night, the place was filled with all kinds of record label execs, celebrities, as well as regular folk. Young and his band stepped onto the stage and delivered a show no one was ever likely to forget in a hurry. Tonight's the night, the show! Welcome to Miami Beach, ladies and gentlemen. Everything is cheaper than it looks. This was the intriguing and somewhat cryptic way Young would introduce every Tonight's the Night live show. They were keeping the vibe from the SIR recording sessions alive. They had simply moved the show now out onto a public stage. In fact, they were doubling down on it. They started to accumulate props and wardrobe to fuel the vibe further on the stage. The props included a cigar store Indian, fake palm trees, Hawaiian shirts, and a whole bunch of platform glitter boots, which Young had duct taped all around the piano. The band came out looking like not only had they not shaved since recording the album, but not even showered either. Young was sporting a pair of Polaroid Coolray 420 fastbacks to cover his bleary bloodshot eyes, and a grey and white seersucker sport coat that Nils Lofgren had gotten from a thrift store. With a thick, unkempt beard, Young to many in the audience now resembled Charles Manson's drunk and dishevelled younger brother. Young and the band also brought their wild between-song patter with them from SIR as well, and the Tequila. They couldn't forget the Tequila. By now they were playing the songs live, night after night, so they actually finished learning them, even though they'd already recorded them. So they dug deeper into the songs and played with even more intensity than on the record. The mood live was completely different, said Lofgren. We were all pissed off about losing a couple of people close to us, and it came out on stage. The vibe was intense but also loose. Young smoked joints that fans threw onto the stage and swigged tequila from a jug that was also passed down to the people in the front. Unlike the Time Fades Away concerts, where the drunkenness Roberts had a sort of depressive vibe to it, fueled by the tense atmosphere backstage. Tonight's the Night was the wake, time to party all the tension out. It was trashed, David Briggs said, but in a controlled way. On the final night at the Roxy, Young got everyone in the audience a drink on the house, which Elliot Roberts was not too impressed with, and offered a pair of glitter boots to the first woman to come up on the stage topless. Young's girlfriend, Carrie Snodgrass, unbuttoned her vest and made her way onto the stage, to the absolute horror of Elliot Roberts and David Geffen. The whole theme of Tonight's the Night was to let go of all that crap and get real, Snodgrass said. So I came up behind Neil, put my arms around his waist. He saw me, started laughing, and then they carried on playing Tonight's the Night. One person who did not really get the point of Tonight's the Night at first was Elliot Roberts, Young's manager. He was just despairing of Young's behaviour at this point and must have been relieved when those Roxy shows came to an end. But a month later, Young took the show even further out on the road. First stop was Canada. They added more stage props. Briggs got hold of a load of auto parts and attached them to Young's piano. Hood ornaments, rear view mirrors, speedometers and hubcaps. Briggs also had t-shirts made for everyone with slogans on them like "Everything is cheaper than it looks," "Equal time for past, present and future," and "Hello, Waterface." Briggs and Young were making sure that the aesthetic vibe of the show remained consistent all the way from the first recording sessions at SIR through the Roxy shows and now out on the road. As Jimmy McDonough says in his biography Shaky, this was group art at its finest. Whether the audience got it or not seemed to be irrelevant. In Canada they apparently did not so much. Briggs noticed with amusement the drained looks on the faces of the crowd as they left after the show. The audience thought they'd come to the wrong building, said Joel Bernstein. People were pissed off. Next up was a week in England and Scotland. A new up-and-coming young band called The Eagles were the opening act. They revered Neil Young, and they were taken aback by the newly tequila-soaked, ramshackle gonzo energy of Young and the Santa Monica Flyers, as they were now called. British audiences were also a little bewildered by the Tonight's the Night travelling circus, expecting an evening of really fine country-flavoured rock and roll and folk rock, but instead, Young said, "We came out and took 'em all to Miami Beach." The set list for these shows was the same as before. Basically, they would come out and play the entire unreleased, unheard Tonight's the Night album, but Young would then sit down and play a few acoustic songs, old favourites such as Helpless, which at the Rainbow in London on the 5th of November was an epic freewheeling version with Ben Keith on dobro and Nils Lofgren on accordion. Young, though, did cajole the audience, especially if they were even slightly restless at the idea of sitting through yet another completely unfamiliar song. In Bristol, Young introduced himself and the band as Clark Kent and the Micronite Filters, saying Neil would be along later. Between songs, he also delivered a monologue about senior citizens in Miami charging up their electric carts to go to a big nightclub show that culminated in an orgy. The crowd were so not into this by the start of the acoustic set that Young left the stage and didn't want to go back on. However, Roberts convinced him to go back out there, which he did, and by the end of the night, the band were back on stage doing Tonight's the Night for the third time of the evening, this time a wild version with Lofgren jumping up and down on the piano, playing guitar with his teeth and attempting to stomp the piano strings with his combat boots. Listening to the audience recorded bootlegs of these live shows, though, reveals that on the whole the audiences were quite willing to go along with Neil on his Tonight's the Night trip, mainly because by this point the band were a lot tighter and knew the songs so well that they couldn't help but deliver fantastic versions of them. Even on the Bristol show tape, though the audience is on the whole pretty quiet, they still clap each song and laugh occasionally at the shenanigans on stage. They were also rewarded for their patience at the end of each show, which most times would close with a couple of familiar songs, including Cowgirl in the Sand. There was negative press though. Melody Maker said the Rainbow show was tedious. He talked too much about nothing and went on for too long, and one disgruntled fan wrote a letter to the paper saying "The real Neil Young is dead." Similar comments were made in Rolling Stone about the Roxy shows. Nevertheless, the group headed back to the US for more shows, starting in New York on the 15th of November, ending in Berkeley on the 23rd. After the tour, Briggs handed Young the finished recordings, and they tried to mix them at Neil's studio through the CompuMix, which was the first ever digital mixing console that had been used on Time Fades Away. Briggs thought the CompuMix sounded like shit and dubbed it the CompuFuck. He suggested remixing the album at Wally Hyder's studio, but neither of them had the energy at this point to remix the entire album, so for now the project was put on hold. Briggs maintained throughout his life that the original version was the only real version, and the released version was watered down so much that he refused to listen to it. However, Young said later, he never mentioned that to me. He never said a thing about it. The way he remembers it, he said, "We had a rough mix of the whole thing, with the raps, the monologues and everything." Then he says somehow the raps got cut out. I don't know how that happened. If Briggs said he'd finished the record and that was it, it's not true, because if he thought it was done, we wouldn't have been fucking around with the masters in the studio. Young says they tried to put the raps back in, but the tape had degraded so much that the sound on the tape had changed significantly and they couldn't get it back. The original version thus remained in limbo until inspiration to finish the album came from a very unlikely source. Elliot Roberts, Young's manager, who was horrified seeing the Tonight's the Night show live, was now floating the idea of turning the Bruce Berry story into a Broadway show. A 24-page treatment was even written for it by writer Mel Froman. To flesh it out musically, they had suggested using 3 extra songs in addition to the 9 recorded at SIR. These songs were "Come On Baby Let's Go Downtown" from the 1970 Crazy Horse Fillmore shows, "Borrowed Tune" and "Look Out Joe" from the Time Fades Away era. Young didn't much like the idea of the big Broadway show, but he liked the track listing with these 3 additional songs. Around this time in 1974, Young was recording another album titled Homegrown that was very near completion, and he was staying at the legendary Chateau Marmont, which was the infamous LA hotel where John Belushi later lost his life. One night, Young was entertaining some guests in his room. These included Rick Danko and Richard Manuel from the band, Ralph and Billy from Crazy Horse, and the singer-songwriter Bobby Charles. Danko, Neil and me were sitting around the piano singing. Ralph said, "I think we'd done a little meth, because when you do meth, the harmonies are beautiful." It was godlike. They sat around listening to the almost completed Homegrown on a reel-to-reel, and then after Homegrown, Tonight's the Night came on, as it was also on that same reel. Rick Danko sat up immediately and said, "What's this?" Danko told Young, "If you guys don't release this fucking album, you're crazy." Young said later, "By listening to those 2 albums back-to-back at the party, I started to see the weaknesses in Homegrown. I took Tonight's the Night ultimately because of its overall strength in performance and feeling. The theme may be a little depressing, but the general feeling is so much more elevating than Homegrown." Young finished the album with the 3 additional songs and informed Warner Brothers that he wanted to release this as his next album. They were waiting for Homegrown, which they thought would be a return to the more commercial pastures of Harvest for Young. Young says they listened to the album together with Warner's in their corporate office at 1 in the afternoon at extremely loud volume, and they hated it, and they tried to talk him out of releasing it. Ultimately though, they did agree to release it, somewhat reluctantly. Everyone thought it was awful, Young said later. CSN hated it, they wouldn't even mention it. Glenn Fry of the Eagles said to him, "Why are you doing this to yourself?" Young said, "I wasn't trying to make a masterpiece, I was trying to capture a moment. I didn't want to clean it up. I had to exorcise those feelings. I felt like it was the only chance I had to stay alive." When the album was released in June of 1975, after On the Beach, which was actually recorded after Tonight's the Night, if that makes sense, it was an outlier in the world of rock, visually as well as sonically. The cover was just a high contrast black and white photo of Young in his seersucker jacket and his fastback shades, arm raised, wagging his finger, the album title scrawled in his handwriting in the top right. The first pressing was printed on blotter paper, which meant it would degrade and fall apart faster than usual. Bundled inside the sleeve was an article by journalist Constant Myers, which was a review of one of the Tonight's the Night live shows. The article expressed confusion and bewilderment over the state of Young and his band's performance. Young had allowed the journalist access in exchange for several bottles of Cuervo Gold. As baffled as he was by the stage presentation, he found Young and the band backstage to be surprisingly upbeat and full of jokes. Young decided to include the article with the album, only untranslated from the original, which was in Dutch. Young said, "It seemed a good idea to print it in Dutch. Nobody in the US would be able to understand it because I didn't understand it myself, and when someone is so sickened and fucked up as I was then, everything's in Dutch anyway." Also included was an insert containing a mysterious letter addressed to somebody named Waterface. It read, "Hello Waterface. Welcome to Miami Beach. Everything is cheaper than it looks. As you know, the Santa Monica Flyer is the fastest train around. It's so fast and straight with its up to date. I'm just down here working on BB's Plane Crash album, and it sure looks good to me. Tonight's the night. We're going to get loose in the caboose with our backs to the tracks. Yes, we're all on vacation and we deserve it. Waterface, I sincerely hope you can make it back in time. It all feels so strange. This train is just too fast. It never stops, you know, unless you get off. But I remember BB. He called my name. He said tell Waterface to put it in his lung and not in his vein. Remember Sambo who used to broadcast from the tank? He's off the air but he doesn't care. I'm sorry. You don't know these people. This means nothing to you. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Just give me a white cane and a Polaroid avoid. Goodbye, Waterface. P.S. Please take my advice." This begs the question, of course. Who the hell was Waterface? Well, don't worry. Young later cleared the whole thing up for us. He said, "Waterface is the person writing the letter. When I read the letter, I'm Waterface. It's just a stupid thing. A suicide note without the suicide." There you go. Perfectly clear, I'm sure you'll agree. Also on the insert were typed the words to the unreleased song Florida, which was later released on the Homegrown album in 2020. I say song, it's more of just a monologue, and the words are printed over the credits to the On the Beach album, which was released the previous year, along with a picture of Roy Orbison from a bootleg cassette Young had found. Everything was in black and white. The original vinyl pressing also had the words "Hello Waterface" and "Goodbye Waterface" etched into the runout on either side. Young says that originally there was meant to be a little plastic bag of glitter as well that came with the album that when opened would spill all over everything, though whether this was actually included in the original run of the album has never been confirmed. So not only had they carried on the vibe and aesthetic all the way through the recording process, all the way through the live performances, but had now packaged it into the album itself as well, despite being 18 months down the line from the original recordings. Young had even insisted on the actual record label being black instead of the orangey brown that Reprise usually was. Overall, it was an impressive artistic achievement for a high-profile major label artist. The album was praised by critics on its release. Robert Christgau gave it an A. Dave Marsh wrote positively about it in Rolling Stone, as did a lot of others. There's a case to be made for it as Young's greatest work. It's certainly his most conceptually cohesive album. Even esteemed Canadian writer Scott Young agreed. Neil's dad. He devoted a whole chapter of his book, Neil and Me, to the album, and he described it as being essential, like a man on a binge at Awake, a long happy bout of not giving a shit. Sadly though, apparently his mum didn't like it. The first time I heard Tonight's the Night, the song, for me was on the Weld live album recorded in 1991. Having only ever read about the song before, I was surprised by how bluesy and catchy it actually was. When I got the original album on vinyl around the year 2000, for some reason I was expecting some really heavy proto-grunge rock like Weld or Ragged Glory. Instead, the first thing you hear on the album are those ominous little piano notes tinkling out of the darkness, the wheezy harmonies, the clean tone. This original version was nothing like the Weld version, which at first was hard to wrap my head around. Lyrically, it tells the story of Bruce Berry in pretty stark terms, and also there's something vaguely unsettling about the titular phrase repeated throughout the song. Tonight's the night that... What's going to happen? Something happens? We do something? It's never revealed, it just keeps on being repeated. It's that word ominous again. Maybe he's saying tonight's the night for the wake to start, or maybe he's just saying the night time is now, i.e. Right Now It's Dark. Young said that Nils Lofgren's solo right after he sings "He Used to Pick Up My Guitar" was deliberately in the style of Bruce Berry. Apparently Berry played guitar just like that brief solo, flashy, fast clusters of notes, and it's this attention to detail that gives the album a layered depth beyond what the otherwise apparently sloppy playing would suggest. The bluesiness continues on the second track, Speaking Out, which from the title sounds like it should be a protest song. I suppose it is, but it's more of an existential protest. He's still in a dark place, both literally, he's in a movie theatre, and emotionally. There's more than a hint of paranoia too, with the TV watching you and the notebook behind the eyes. And this is probably the only time you'll ever hear Neil Young introducing another band member as they play a guitar solo. Lofgren's solo here is pretty amazing, given that he barely knew the song when they were recording it. World on a String is one he would come back to again later as well, playing it on the MTV Unplugged performance in 1993. He's saying all the success and fame in the world is pretty much worthless if your friends die. It's only real in the way that you feel from day to day. Borrowed Tune is literally that, as the song uses the same melody as the Rolling Stones song Lady Jane from their 1966 album Aftermath. Well, maybe it's just a stolen tune actually, because I'm not sure if Neil ever gave it back. I'm climbing this ladder, my head in the clouds, I hope that it matters. It's the winter here in this song. The ice is frozen 6 feet deep, and the question, how long does it take? It's not clear whether he means how long will it take to melt or how long does it take to freeze. Either way, it's bleak. 6 feet deep, by the way, like a freshly dug grave. Sticking his head in the clouds seems to help, but he's doubtful about that too. He's so frozen in this moment, he can't even compose his own melody. Never mind pull himself out of this frozen grave pit. Come on baby, let's go downtown thunders in as Borrowed Tune ends, and suddenly we're hearing the departed Danny Whitten's voice imploring us to join him downtown to score, just as the full moon is rising, the light shining back from his dealer's eye, an absolutely chillingly foreboding image. If you were wondering if Danny Whitten was as great a songwriter as he was a singer, look no further. Whitten died 2 days before the full moon in November 1972. In many cultures, November's full moon is connected with death and loss. Many Native Americans referred to it as the moon when rivers start to freeze. Young refers to the full moon a lot in his work and has placed great importance on booking studio time when there's a full moon to record with Crazy Horse. It can have ominous connotations, but Young also sees the positive aspect of the full moon too, which really is about allowing the fullness of feeling to flow and to not censor yourself. Two things which this album is all about. Mellow My Mind is a desperate plea to someone to somehow alleviate all these heavy feelings. The way his voice cracks on the line, ain't got nothing. Ralph Molina said, I still get chills when it gets to that fucking note. It's so real. Roll Another Number opens side 2 of the album. It was written in the studio during recording, and they sound well lubricated. The song is funny enough to be a moment of lighter relief on the album, whilst also still being just as bleak in outlook as the rest of the songs. Things might have gone to shit, but they're partying through it anyway. Albuquerque sees us out on the road that Roll Another Number had promised us, and it's somewhere out on the desert highway of New Mexico in a rented car. The desert is an appealing place if you want to be away from people and the scene that you've been part of. The desire for anonymity is something we all experience sometimes, even if we're not famous. New Mama was written for Carrie, the mother of Young's son Zeke, who was born in September 1972. Young decided to include this song to bring a bit of balance to the album, making sure there was a little bit of light in amongst the darkness. That even in the midst of death and grief, there's still new life coming into the world. If you think this song sounds a bit out of place with the rest of the album, I would advise you to take into consideration the poignant fact that one of the backing singers on this song is one George Whitzel, who was originally in the Rockets with Danny Whitten, Molina and Talbot before they splintered off with Young to become Crazy Horse in 1969. Lookout Joe was recorded before the Harvest Tour during rehearsals in late 1972. Before those recordings were scrapped in favour of recording live on the road. As such, this is the Stray Gators that are playing on this song. Ken Buttery on drums, Jack Nietzsche on the piano. It fits in so well with the Tonight's the Night vibe though that you almost don't notice the different personnel. Young said on stage this song was about soldiers coming home from Vietnam. Cars seem to be a theme throughout this side of the record. It seems Bill sells his Cadillac to buy something to put in his arm. The theme continues with the next song, which is the darkest and bleakest moment of this nighttime of tonight. Tired Eyes. Again, we wonder what Young means exactly when he implores us to open up the tired eyes. What does he want us to see at this time of night? Well, a cocaine deal gone bad. It was actually a real event. It didn't happen directly in Young's circle, but he was close enough to it to learn some of the details and catch the vibe in a song. The events of the song took place sometime after midnight on April the 19th, 1972. There was an orgy underway in Topanga Canyon on Vision Drive. Outside the house was a drug deal occurring, but things went badly wrong. A Topanga resident known as the Doctor, who was self-admittedly a big-ass coke dealer, was involved in shifting a serious amount from two others, one who was a friend and the other who he didn't know. They had to make my deal to pay off another one of theirs that had gone bad, he said later. He had to sell all their stuff and have the money for them that night, but he encountered difficulty with this and struggled to achieve this, so the connection came back demanding his coke back, but ended up shooting the Doctor's friend through the back of his head. Chaos ensued, with the Doctor firing some shots back as he scrambled away, shooting the connection dead in the process. The Doctor abandoned his car full of drugs and money and escaped before the police arrived on the scene. The partygoers in the house came out to find a car full of coke and cash and two dead bodies lying in the driveway. The details of the double murder became common knowledge amongst the Topanga crowd, which included David Briggs. It's possibly the best song on the album, which is maybe why Young included it on Decade a few years later. The vibe is Wild Horses recited by a drunken preacher and is the doomy, intoxicated feel of the album captured in its purest form. Finishing the album is Tonight's the Night, Part 2. This represents the first time that Young had the same song opening and closing an album. The next instance when he would do this was Rust Never Sleeps. The song is the same but was recorded on a different date to the first version and has a slightly different feel to it. It's looser, more open. Clearly they were more lubricated at this stage. Some would argue this is in fact Neil Young's greatest album, which it may well be. I can't really decide between this one and After the Gold Rush, if I'm being honest. It's certainly the darkest, but overall the experience of Tonight's the Night is strangely uplifting in a way. Just like Awake, it gives you permission to unload the weight off your back. A brilliant achievement. Neil Young gives you a rock and roll record about death and grief that is harrowing, but at the same time liberating. It doesn't shy away from the reality that tired eyes need to see, and it also invites you in to experience catharsis along with the band, even if you didn't know the people that they're singing about. Everyone loses someone at some point, and I can attest to the cathartic power of this music to provide a great deal of comfort through that moment. So there you have it. Tonight was the night. After the night came the morning, and Neil and his friends headed down to the beach. But that's a story for next time. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Check out some of the other videos that we've got. You may enjoy them. But that's all from me on this one. Goodbye, Waterface. P.S. Please take my advice.
Tonight's the night. 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 Tonight's the night.